A very, very warm welcome and greeting to all of you on behalf of the Organizing Committee for Words, London's Literary and Creative Arts Festival. My name is Josh Lambier, and I'm the Artistic Director of the festival. We are honored and thrilled to have all of you with us for the 5th anniversary of the festival this year. We're excited to present a full weekend of events with over 40 regional, national artists, authors, and thinkers. Over the course of the weekend, we have lectures on the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein, on fitness as a feminist issue, as well as an examination of the children's plays of James Rainey. We have an event that will focus our collective attention on the place of the Thames River in London through the lens of poetic and musical performance. We have an open mic poetry night, Poetry Live, that will take place Saturday night, and anybody who has a creative inclination towards poetry can come and share your work. We have a feature presentation on the comic and graphic artists of southwestern Ontario, which coincides with an exhibition on here at Museum London, which you can find on this second floor. We have an instant magazine team collecting your contributions tonight and tomorrow to produce the Words Fest zine, which has a focus this year on Frankenstein. We're affectionately calling it the Frankenzine. We have relaunched our local authors book fair in the Sowesto Book Expo space, which is downstairs in the newly renovated and gorgeous Center at the Forks space, and congratulations to the museum on the launch of that. In that space, and for any of you who are focusing on the craft of writing, we have workshops this weekend that are for writing poetry, for writing screenplays, and doing research for writers. All of these events are free to you, the public, to come and experience over Saturday and Sunday here at the festival. It's going to be a tremendous weekend, chock-a-block with events to check out. But tonight, our opening reception, we have a fabulous launch for our 5th anniversary that will unfold on 3 acts. The first part will start with our host, Janice Zolf, who will be in conversation with London's award-winning author, Emma Donoghue. Yes. Part 2, I'm going to return the stage, but I'm bringing with me 4 of our feature authors, including Cherie Dimaline, Jane Urquhart, Lisa Moore, and Tom Cull. In our final act, we'll go downstairs and we'll have a chance to mingle, grab a drink, and you can meet our feature authors, and we've equipped them with the name tags that have a nice bulletined yellow coating around it to identify the authors and performers in the room. So that's our itinerary for the evening tonight. So let's get started with our opening act. I would like to welcome to the stage Janice Zolf, whom you will all know from 25 years of reporting on the arts, entertainment, and fashion here in London. She moved to Montreal in 2016, where she directed the films Revealing Marie St. Pierre, which was broadcast on CBC's documentary channel, Michael Bublé, Audacious, for the National Film Board, and Mew, about the murals of Montreal, which continues to tour festivals around the world. She is currently developing the film and digital series Into the Light with Cité Mémoire, about the world's largest multimedia projections. Aside from her films, she is proud of her interviews that many of you have seen with Vincent Lam, Andre Alexis, Ian Brown, and other great Canadian writers for the last 4 years here at Words. Please welcome to the stage Janice Zolf.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Now I actually see how many people are here. This is fantastic. Having been here for the last 5 years, I can tell you this is the biggest crowd we've had. So a warm welcome to all of you tonight. Khalil Gibran, the great poet and philosopher, said, "All our words are but crumbs that fall from the feast of the mind." Tonight and throughout this entire wonderful weekend at Words Fest, prepare to feast on the words of some of Canada's most gifted writers as we celebrate the literary and creative forces that move us in so many different and important ways. And having been involved with the creative art scene in this city for well over 30 years, I can tell you that there is so much creative excellence in this city, especially when it comes to words, and I'm very proud to be a part of it as your host. Well, from the beginning, this festival was meant to be a forum for our region's and country's most inspirational writers and to showcase London as the center for creativity. The last 5 years have been so special. I've stood up here and watched the crowds build, the support build, the media take hold of this wonderful weekend and talk about it. But none of it would be possible without your support, so we thank you for coming back year after year. I see some familiar faces here. And also the generous sponsors that have supported us from day one. I urge you to read about them in your program so that you can see what they've done for us. But I would like to acknowledge 3 sponsors in particular who are hosting our opening night tonight. They are learners and senior partner Peter Downs. Peter, there you are, right in the front row with your book. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Scotia Wealth Management, in particular, the Kellen and Van Simpson portfolio groups, thank you so much. I know some of you are over here. And John Payton, he's right out of the building. I think he's in Paris, or is that where he is? Paris? Where he lives now. John Payton was the former publisher of the London Free Press. He's been our supporter from day one, our sponsor. He's been in love with words his whole life, and we really thank him from afar. So we're sending him good vibes. So please join me in thanking all our sponsors. Now later on, after our conversation with Emma, we're going to have a panel discussion by many well-known writers who have been shortlisted, long-listed. There's a Governor General's Award winner there, our poet laureate, led by our creative director, Josh Lambier, who every year weaves stories and inspiration together in ways that I can't figure out. I bow down to you, Josh. You're amazing at what you do, and it's always the highlight after the evening, or after our one-on-one. But after the panel, we'd like to invite you downstairs to the new Museum London space, overlooking the Forks of the Thames for chats with our authors, book signings, and wine. And I think Josh told you how you can identify everybody with a yellow sticker. So mingling is always great. So we will be mingling right after until the wee hours of the morning. Well, Emma Donoghue. I don't know how I even begin to introduce such a talent. If I told you everything on Emma's bio, we probably wouldn't have time for the interview. So suffice to say that Emma was born in Dublin in 1969 and now calls London home. Her most recent work and her second book for younger readers, The Lottery's More or Less. Here's what it looks like if you want to go downstairs and buy it and get it signed tonight. It's a sequel to The Lottery's Plus One, which was described by the New York Times as delightful, warm, and funny. And it made the best of the year's list of Publishers Weekly and the Irish Times. Her most recent novel for adults, The Wonder About a Fasting Girl, and we'll hear all about that, in 1850s Ireland, was shortlisted for Ireland's Kerry Group Novel of the Year, as well as the Giller Prize, and she's currently adapting it for the screen. Her novel, Room, I'm sure all of you know about. That best-selling book was shortlisted for the Man Booker and Orange Prizes and has sold more than 2 million copies. 2 million plus a few thousand more tonight, I think, Emma. The feature film based on Room was nominated for 4 Academy Awards: Best Adapted Screenplay by Emma Donoghue, Best Director, Best Picture, and Best Actress, which was won by Brie Larson. Emma is also adapting her novel Frog Music, a literary mystery inspired by a murder in 1870s San Francisco. That's being developed into a feature film. She's written 5 other novels, 5 short story collections, 3 works of literary history, and 2 anthologies that span the 17th to the 20th centuries. That's the short bio. Please join me in welcoming Emma Donoghue. So nice to see you. You can sit right here. So I think I'll stick with this one.
Let's see if mine works. Oh, excellent.
Otherwise, we've got an extra for you over there. So you're adapting frog music to a film.
You know, it's very odd. The film business is a hard one to break into. It's not like other forms of writing. It's like trying to become a spy or something. You know, you have to wait for them to come to you. You can't go knocking on the door and saying, let me be a spy. So like many writers, I found that the film doors seemed closed to me. But then because of Room going so well, you know, little Irish-Canadian film filmed in Toronto, goes all the way to the Oscars. So suddenly I got lots of opportunities and the door kept swinging open. So yes, I'm involved in a number of film projects, and a couple of them are adapting my own books, and a couple are adapting other people's books. I'm adapting a Sarah Waters novel, for instance. Such a treat to climb inside a Sarah Waters plot and figure out how all the gleaming cogs click together, you know?
It's a very different use of your skills, writing screenplays versus writing novels.
That's true. I think writing for film and TV is great as long as you realize that you have no power at all. You are a hired writer. You are doing piecework. You're doing each individual draft, and even if you kid yourself at the time, you know, as you finish the draft, you think, I wrote something here. But then, you know, it's just one of an infinite number of drafts. They don't even tell you in advance how often they will ask you to rewrite it. And as to whether all the money comes together so that the thing finally gets filmed, who knows? So you have way less power, but it's very sociable, and they do, you know, lunches, and if you're lucky enough for the film to actually get made, there are things called red carpets, which don't come up in many a book writer's life.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's way more glamorous, but you're a marginal figure, whereas in fiction, it's all less glamorous, but you're the queen bee. So pros and cons.
But with Room, you were actually there on the set.
Yes, I used to go up on the Greyhound, and I'd go more or less humbly knock on the door of the film studio near Cherry Beach. I remember the first day I didn't know how to get into the studio without disrupting something. I thought they might be filming a key scene, so I just froze outside the door until some intern said, "There's a light, you know, it goes red when they're filming." And even on the last day, you know, I had visited the set quite often, and I was beginning to feel, oh yes, I'm in this business. And then as I turn up outside the psychopath's house in Scarborough, where we're filming the final scenes, one of the sort of bodyguard people stopped me and said, "You can't come this way, they're filming a movie." So, you know, there are many ways to feel on the outside of a busy film set, but it was always fascinating.
But you don't have to fill the page with words. You can let the film breathe a little bit.
It's funny, yes, you shouldn't fixate on the dialogue because, first of all, they'll cut a lot of it. So there's no point you're writing the perfect line or even the perfect scene. It may get cut for reasons of weather or budget. So you shouldn't obsess over any one line in your script. You just try and give the whole script as much of the right feel of the story as you can, yeah.
Because that film felt very natural, and often I think movies don't live up to the book, but in this case, it was a great movie, and I mean, a lot of that had to do with you writing the screenplay for it. But the way you wrote it and adapted it for the screen, you allowed the actors to be natural and to have natural dialogue so that we, the audience, felt that we were viewing a mother and son just in their everyday world.
Yes, and you know, to be honest, we got Jake Tremblay to sort of ad-lib a lot of his dialogue. It was based on my dialogue, but with a child that young, you know, he was 7 when we hired him, and so you don't want to say to him, "Say the comma right, young man." You know, it's much better to get him chatting along the lines of. So quite often our director was lying down in the bathtub, so to be below the sight level, or sometimes he was in under the floorboards, speaking out through a little hole in the floorboards, because there was nowhere for him to hide in that room. So quite often he was there, you know, in the wardrobe or in the bath, sort of talking the child through it, you know, getting him to come up with something which would sound very natural, because as you say, we just absolutely had to believe in that mother and that child.
But what's it like for a writer working on a film with your script? I mean, you have to let go to a certain extent, don't you?
Absolutely, but the air of extreme competence and professionalism in common between everyone on that set made me feel, oh, you know, it's in safe hands here. I remember noticing that on the set, the designers had drawn in like little faces around the electrical outputs the way a child would. You know, the costume designer told me how she had a sort of character arc for each person in it. She said to me, like, the child at first will be in nasty sweatshirts that his captor will buy in Walmart, and then he'll be in, you know, plush things that his grandmother has bought for him on his release, but then he'll be in the clothes he actually likes at the end. And I thought, okay, everyone here is putting such thought into everything. I don't need to try and control it anymore.
You use your own children as inspiration for your books.
I sometimes feel bad how much I do that. Yeah. I don't think I've published anything in the last 15 years that doesn't owe something to them. In the case of writing for children, I harvest lines and ideas and accidents and episodes from them. My son once made me pay for a joke, but apart from that, I just take everything for free. And I take their advice on things. My daughter and I are currently arguing about what should happen in the fourth of the Lotteries books. I'm hoping she'll change her mind by the time we get to it. But yeah, they take real ownership over my work. And my son is dead proud of pointing to, Room, which has a notoriously sick premise, and saying, I inspired that.
Yeah, his teachers must be giving you calls, wondering how that happened. But, maybe while we're on that subject, we could talk about the fact that there was a lot of hope in that book, and there's hope in most of your writing.
Very much. I think sometimes just the one-line version, when I tell people what my books are about, they can sound rather sick. But yeah, I'm nearly always trying to find some kind of human warmth at the heart of it. Or rather, I wouldn't write a book about an 11-year-old who's not eating unless I was planning to give you some kind of reward for putting in the time, In a way, it's a kind of a contract for me. Not that I have a very set group of fans the way, say, a murder mystery writer might have, but even if it's different fans for each book, I feel, come with me on this journey, but I'm not going to put you through all that misery for nothing, So I feel responsible to my readers to kind of weigh up how much pain they can take and how much anxiety,
Well, you've just talked about or mentioned writing about an 11-year-old girl who's fasting in Ireland. So this is the subject of The Wonder.
That's right. And that book was sort of anti-inspired by my daughter, meaning I used to look at her sitting there, tucking into sandwiches and pasta. And I would think, okay, she's brimming with health and a natural, normal greed, and she always wants as much food as her brother. And I thought, by contrast, I was sort of conjuring up in my mind, what if you had a child of equal capacity and intelligence and energy, but growing up in the rather stunting atmosphere of post-famine Irish Catholicism? What might it do to a child like that if she was always rewarded for not eating, for being a good girl, for doing without? Whereas if you grow up in London, Ontario today, you're pretty much encouraged to sort of, enjoy all you can in life. But if you were in a very different setting, you might take all that same intelligence and wit and decide to devote it to being so good that you didn't eat.
But let's talk about how you came up with this idea in the first place. It's actually
there were a number of real fasting girl cases. I mean, not huge numbers. I suppose writers are nearly always choosing cases that are statistically anomalous. But often they show something really true about our lives too. For instance, in the case of Room, I wasn't seriously trying to do a commentary on the lives of children who are raised in locked rooms. It's more that I was trying to illuminate something about just everyday motherhood in London, Ontario, or anywhere, but through putting motherhood in the weird spotlight of a kidnapped situation. And similarly with The Wonder, I'm writing about, I would say I found about 50 cases, all told, of people who claim to live without food. So from about 16th century Europe, some in North America. There was a famous one in Brooklyn. So they're very rare cases, but I think they're really interesting because often they show up what our society was not quite saying. Messages like, the more feminine you are, the less you will eat, that kind of thing. So these rare cases can really make that very literal, like, look how good I am, I don't need food.
And you've mentioned before, I think, that Ireland is often defined by the Great Famine.
Yeah. So I thought, I could have set a book about fasting anywhere, but first of all, if you're going to kind of attack a culture or religion, it's more honest to do it about your own religion, So I thought, Irish Catholicism is where I'm from, so I'm going to set the story there. And also, even in the version of Irish Catholicism that I grew up with, there was a lot about, if you have, a sty on your eye or something, you should offer that up, as if it would be a little treat for Jesus. Like, oh, Emma's in pain, marvelous. So this weird strain of the ascetic and the slightly masochistic, frankly. A lot of those 19th century prayers, all about wash me in the blood of Jesus. There's a strange relish. There's a kind of a sensuality turned inside out there. So as I say, it seemed fairer to do that about my own home culture rather than about somebody else's.
So then the wonder is rooted in historical fact, but you take it to a different space entirely. The young girl, Anna O'Donnell, she's 11, and she's seriously ill.
I think contemporary themes always show up in your historical fiction. They're not separate. So of course I was inspired by, a friend I know whose daughter was anorexic. I'm inspired by the things I read as well. So for me, there's no clear distinction between historical and contemporary fiction. In that, whatever's going through your mind today will of course show up when you're writing a story set back then. And I don't think that's anachronistic. I think that's just the writer is always going to bring what's on their mind to the project. And similarly, something set in the near future, like The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood has famously talked about how she got everything in there from some moment in women's history. She limited herself to the terrible things that have been done to women, in fact, in the past. So for me, that line between the past and the present and the future has never been very clear. I just like to harvest interesting stuff from wherever my imagination goes.
But when you zoom into the psyche of this young girl, you can see how today kids can be radicalized, and there is some relevance.
That's right, yes. I thought not just about kids with eating disorders, but about, zealous teenagers getting into online groups and then going off to fight jihad. And there seems so many parallels when you take the pure idealism and fervor and, frankly, ignorance and naivety of teenagers. Yeah.
Would you like some water? Oh, you got some, okay. You talked briefly about the lotteries and how your own kids have been inspiration.
But the lotteries it's like a fantasy version of my life because I've ended up with 2 kids, but I'm from a family of 8, so 2 feels a little bit shrunken to me. So I thought I would just write about what would feel like a normal family to me, 8 kids. And my publisher said, that's a ridiculous number of children. That couldn't be. Even though, there are 4 parents involved. So I thought 8 kids is not that many for 4 parents. So my publishers tried to bargain me down to 5 children, and I didn't think that counted as a big family at all. So we agreed. I killed off 1 character. Got us down to 7, though my son will never forgive me because I happened to kill off the 11-year-old boy, and he was an 11-year-old boy at the time. But the character I killed off was an introvert, and I'm sorry, introverts just don't always quite earn their place in the story,
But this is a family whose philosophy is why not?
Indeed. They're a family who... They live in Toronto in a kind of a Parkdale with ravines, and they are homeschooling all their kids because the premise of my story is that, these 2 men and 2 women had a baby together, but then they win the lottery by accident. They pick up a ticket off the floor of the maternity ward, and they decide to have lots more kids and homeschool them all. So it's the life that I imagine in my more deluded moments that I would have liked to live, everything big. Whereas in fact, I'm more than happy sending my kids off on the school bus so I can get my books written. But I like imagining, the lotteries do things like, plunge into Lake Ontario to fundraise for penguins at New Year. In the next book, they're going to climb the CN Tower. All these things I will never get around to doing myself.
But you also deal with issues like dementia. The grandfather has dementia.
Yeah, I think of the Grumps character in the first book. Their grandfather has to move in with them because he set his house on fire. He left the deep fryer on, which is like the leading cause of house fires, apparently. And this character, in a way, was my mother's gift to me because she had the early stages of dementia at the time, and I was even able to talk to her and say, like, can I use that? And she was all for my using things. I decided to take something very painful to me, which was gradually losing my mother from dementia, and, see could I use it, and also see could I find reasons to research it and think about it that weren't always making me sad. So it just gives you a little distance on a painful subject if you're going to use it in your books. And I feel my mother would have thoroughly approved as she was such a fervent reader, So, yeah.
So you normalize situations, and this is one of the reasons you wrote this book, because somebody challenged you.
Oh, yeah, that's right. A friend was serving us a lovely New Year's meal, a friend in Toronto, and she said to me, you know, your kids have two mothers and my kids have two mothers. Why can't you write a book about a family where they have two mothers and it's just normal? And I said to her, well, I'm sorry, if it's just normal, that doesn't make for a very entertaining story. So, in fact, I took her idea and I ran the other way with it. I thought, how abnormal can I make them? I'll give them two fathers as well, and they'll be homeschooling, and they'll be millionaires, and yet they're going through their neighbor's garbage because they are so eco-friendly, they like to reuse every little object. So I thought it would be great fun to make a family who really normality is the last thing on their mind, and then to give it a slightly utopian big family feel, because I grew up on all that Victorian children's fiction, people like E. Nesbit and Noel Stratfield and so on. And I liked the idea that you take this alternative family who are all multicultural, but actually give it a very kind of old-fashioned cozy vibe. Because I don't think, I hate that moment in children's books when they introduce some heavy issue and everything grinds to a halt while an adult explains, you know. And I thought, okay, I just refuse to do that. I'm going to make it blithe and breezy, even about issues like, say, the youngest child in the book, Oak, he's quite delayed because somebody shook him before the lotteries adopted him. But I don't have any moment where things grind to a halt and they talk about disability. I'm just, you know, just as the family wants to include him in all their fun, I want to do the same thing in literary terms. I refuse to think of either the old man with dementia or the baby with a delay as people who sort of kill the vibe in the fiction. I think humor can help with almost every subject.
But so many of your books are inclusive with all your characters. I think back to Slammerkin as well. You like your characters as a reader. You identify with them, even though they might be an outlier.
You know, my novel, Slammerkin, which was my first historical novel way back in 2000 here, that really taught me something because I didn't think anybody would like it, in that the girl is a very bad-tempered, selfish girl who makes consistently poor choices, and it doesn't end well. So it was very hard to sell that novel, and one publisher turned me down on the basis that their readers prefer rags to riches stories, not rags to more rags. And my publishers at the time, it's funny, friends often think once you're published, you're somehow safe, like it's a civil service job. Not at all. I was with Penguin and HarperCollins at the time, and they dumped me. They both dumped me. And so I thought the book was going to ruin my career, and then it sold better than anything of mine had till that point. So I thought, first of all, publishers don't know. They have no idea what's going to sell. So you should just write what you like. But I also realized that readers out there are more than capable of making that emotional leap and strongly connecting with 18th century Welsh servant girl who makes bad choices, you know? So you should never underestimate readers by thinking that what they want is relatable, easy subject matter.
I find that it's kind of condescending when a writer doesn't want to take me into something interesting the way your characters are in these situations like Slammerkin. You want your reader to struggle a bit when they're reading.
Yeah, and you want them to come to like a character in spite of themselves, because of the magic that fiction works. I mean, basically, if you write something from the point of view of a villain, you know, we don't think of them as a villain, we think of them as us. Point of view has a hugely powerful psychological effect. So if you can work that magic, you don't want to make it too easy for yourself by starting with somebody likable, you know?
But yet in Room, you made Old Nick, the villain, quite dull.
Yes, I deliberately did nothing to bond my reader to Old Nick, yeah. In fact, I wanted to take all the glamour out of him because I'm really sick of that trope of the fascinating serial killer with his, you know, meticulous preparations and his, you know, intriguing room hidden behind a wall. So I even gave Old Nick really dull decor. You know, when the police finally go through his house, there's like a Stairmaster and a massage chair. You know, I almost made fun of how banal this man's evil was. I tried to think of him as just your kind of standard wife beater or, you know, Nazi camp guard, like just, you know, guys who think they own weaker people, basically. I tried to give him that form of evil rather than the kind of exoticized sexual evil, because so often our stories end up making the killer or the rapist seem like a fascinating character and the girls are so anonymous. So I just wanted to reverse that and keep the kidnapper so much in the shadows.
Yes,
you know?
Thank you for changing that. Obviously, many people agree here. I read somewhere that you think it's good as a writer to be promiscuous, and that is to cheat on yourself as a writer. Do you want to explain that?
Well, okay, it makes me sound bad, right? Can I just say that Chris and I are celebrating a quarter of a century this year, right? So, maybe if my private life had been more wildly outrageous and zigzag, I wouldn't need to do this in my fiction so much. But, here I am living in a fairly sedate city, so I need excitement mentally. So, yes, I cheat on my own books. It's true. At the moment, I have 2 deadlines with film companies. And the next thing I'm meant to be doing is a rewrite of a novel that I've already sold. What am I working on? A brand new novel. Can't tell anyone about it. So, I'm writing to the film companies going, oh yeah, busy working away on your draft. And I'm sneaking off to Weldon and researching something else.
Well, you write in the back of cars, you write while your kids are at tennis lessons, you write where your kids are in the room with you.
And kids sometimes resent that, like at ice skating, when they look up, from a fall perhaps, and they see my head's still down over the laptop. I feel I definitely look worse than all the other parents who are, cheering their kids on,
But so you're always writing something, a short story in the wings, a film.
I write in parked cars, though sometimes the sunlight does slightly bother me, but yeah. And I particularly like signing my kids up for long lessons. I mean, there's a tennis lesson at Western. It's an hour and a half every Sunday afternoon, just when I'm craving some work time. It's perfect.
Do you feel, looking forward to your life in 10 years, 20 years from now, that there will be an endless combination of words for you? Are there many more words to explore?
Oh, yes, I hope to die in the traces, like Boxer the horse, yeah. Sometimes when I'm on an airplane, a small airplane, coming in from Toronto or something, and it's wobbly, I know those planes are not actually more likely to kill you, but it feels like they are.
Yes.
And so I find myself thinking, oh no, but I've got 5 more books to write, I can't die yet. So yes, I just hope this keeps going, yeah.
And films, television,
Indeed,
plays?
Indeed, and yeah, probably genres I haven't tried yet, because that's the real way to make yourself feel stimulated, is the sheer fear of, writing in a form you've never done before and afraid you'll make a fool of yourself.
Yeah. Well, Emma, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Emma Donoghue. We have a present for you. Do you want to hold this up and show it to the audience? This is our first annual Words Award for a writer who has made a significant contribution to the landscape of words across Canada, and also a significant contribution in your own community, because despite the fact that you have this international career, you do interviews all over the world, you work all over the world, I hear podcasts with you all over the world, you managed to find time to stay involved in the community of London. I meant to ask you, do we claim you as our own, or does Dublin still claim you?
Oh, you can claim me. Yeah, you can claim me.
And just so you know, this work of art was done by Ian Greasley, who's here somewhere. Ian, can you wave? Oh, there he is. He's way back there. He's an artist from London, and these are letters from the London Free Press. These are original block letters from the London Free Press, and he's put them together to say words. And we're very proud that you are our first recipient. It's very special. Very metaphorical, given what you do. Thank you so much, Emma. It's been a pleasure. And now I'd like to invite our creative director, Josh Lambier, up to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Janice. That was tremendous, and warm congratulations, Emma, on being our first recipient of the Words Award, which does indeed recognize outstanding contributions to the literary arts in London. We're thrilled to have you with us, and we're thrilled by the contributions that you make to this community constantly. It's phenomenal. It's a special privilege for me to be joining you this evening at the 5th anniversary of the Words Festival. As I was preparing my remarks for this evening, it was, to be very honest, moving to reflect on the first 5 years of the Words Festival in light of this year's festival theme, community. I have the special privilege of introducing the festival, but I am only one voice of a dynamic team of community volunteers and creative professionals who make this festival possible. So let me take a moment to honor these individuals and their work on our 5th anniversary. In January of 2014, I, like others, received an email from Brian Meehan, the executive director here at Museum London. It had a curious subject line, Writers' Festival. It turned out to be an invitation to gather a group of literary organizers across the city to address a common goal, to launch a festival devoted to readers and writers. You might liken it to Tolkien's Lord Elrond summoning strangers from different distant lands and friends of old to forge our emergent fellowship. Our motley crew of strangers and old friends, however, comprised representatives from Western, Fanshawe, Poetry London, Brick Books, Museum London, Insomniac Press, and the London Public Library. Our challenge was to muster in what seemed an impossibly short period of time the resources and the wherewithal to launch our festival. Rob Painter, who really deserves the credit, and actually a round of applause for Rob because he did do this. So Rob is kind of a Gandalf figure for us, if you can keep this metaphor. He went to the four corners of the city to find out whether we could make this impossible mission possible. And he carried forward the vision and passion of our passion for words, the frame of our new festival. To our profound delight, we discovered that our community shared our vision and our enthusiasm for a festival devoted to words. In that first year, we gratefully welcomed our title sponsors, Scotia Wealth Management, Learners, and John Payton, sponsors who have continued to support us each year. This mission would not have been possible without you. And we further were heartwarmed to discover that our vision struck a note with our funding councils, the London Arts Council and the Ontario Arts Council, as well as Western Libraries. These individuals are the ones that make this festival free to everyone. So let's recognize them. I dwell on the story of our festival's genesis not simply for the sake of affectionate pause-taking, which I think is an important thing to do on an anniversary year. I do so because it serves to illustrate the power of community to forge change. At a time when public life seems particularly dark in the world, I'm heartwarmed to reflect on words as an example of the power of community. We created the festival collectively with the conviction that the literary imagination has an important role to play not only in the arts, but also in the promotion of citizenship and civic engagement. Reflecting on our first 5 years in light of the idea of community, I think of the words of Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And make no mistake about it, London and Southwestern Ontario artists, intellectuals, and creatives have changed the world. Our words are powerful. Our words are capable of changing the world. To pose a challenge to that strange orange man in a big white house, I would submit that we here in London have the best words. Southwestern Ontario, or Sowesto, to invoke that name that Greg Curnow and writer James Rainey gave to the region in the 1960s, has a long history of nurturing Canada's brightest thinkers and writers, such as the celebrated Robertson Davies, John Kenneth Galbraith, the advisor of other presidents, Nobel Prize-winning author Alice Munro. In fact, it was on the heels of the announcement of Alice's win that we launched this festival. The Words Festival was established to celebrate the outstanding history of writers who have a meaningful and significant connection to the City of London and the surrounding area, a mission that is now embodied in the Words Festival Award, with Emma as the first of what we hope will be many years to come in the future for the Words Festival. We have a vibrant community of writers, poets, thinkers in this city who are regularly publishing new and exciting works. There is a lively literary scene of activity with regular, well-attended meetings of the London Poetry Slam, Poetry London, Open Mic Poetry, and the London Writers' Society, to name only a few. We created the festival with the belief that we as a community should celebrate and bring more visibility to these achievements. And we also acknowledge that Sowesto is located in the traditional territory of the Attawandaron Neutral peoples, alongside of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. The community is home to a diverse Indigenous population, and we affirm our commitment, ongoing, to support the artistic contributions and achievements of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis writers in our region and beyond. That's a big, important contribution, a big priority for us moving forward. So we hope that Words brings London's creativity to the world while introducing our community to new ideas, new books, and new authors. So now I'd like to welcome to the stage our authors, and I'm going to do so each time. As I start to read your bio, why don't you come on up? Lisa Moore is the acclaimed author of novels Caught, February, and Alligator. Caught was a finalist for the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction and the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and is now a major CBC television series starring Alan Hocko. February won CBC's Canada Reads competition, was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and was named a New Yorker Best Book of the Year and the Globe and Mail Top 10 Book. Alligator was a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and was a national bestseller. Her story collection Open was a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller and a national bestseller. She lives in St. John's, Newfoundland, and is here going to be talking this weekend about her new book, Something for Everything. Jane Urquhart is the author of 8 internationally acclaimed novels, among them The Whirlpool, Away, the winner of the Trillium, The Underpainter, winner of the Governor General's Award, and finalist for the Orange Prize, Stone Carvers, the shortlisted finalist for the Giller Prize and the Governor General's Award, The Night Stages. As a poet, Jane has written 4 books of poetry, a collection of short fiction, and a biography of the Canadian author Lucy Maud Montgomery. She is an officer of the Order of Canada and a Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters in France. Cherie Dimaline is a writer and editor from the Georgian Bay Métis community in Ontario who has published 4 books of short stories, literary fiction, and young adult fiction. Her latest book, The Marrow Thieves, won the 2017 Governor General's Award and the prestigious Kirkus Prize for Young Readers, was a finalist for the White Pine Award and a selection for CBC's 2018 Canada Reads. She was also named an Emerging Artist of the Year for the Ontario Premier's Awards for Excellence. She is currently Western's writer in residence. And lastly but not least, Tom Cull teaches creative writing at Western and serves as our city's poet laureate. His work has appeared in the New Quarterly, The Word Horde, and has been anthologized in Translating Horses, 150 stories, and a collection dedicated to water, protection, and social justice. His chapbook, What the Badger Said, was published in 2013 by Baseline, and his new book of poems, Bad Animals, was recently published by Insomniac Press. Tom has been the director of the Thames River Rally, a grassroots environmental group that he co-founded. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Okay. So I actually want to ask a question of all of you on community, and I'm going to start with Cherie. I know the question of community is absolutely foundational to your work and may be very difficult to address within a limited time, but you have noted the importance of making sure that the stories you tell are in connection with community and nation. And you've also remarked on the value of having a community-oriented view in your understanding of storytelling. And I was wondering if you could talk about that connection between community and storytelling for you.
Yeah, sure. So I come from the Georgian Bay Métis community. Originally, we were Red River people. We left that land and ended up on Drummond Island. The Canadian government did this really helpful thing where they moved us off the island when they gave it to the United States. So at that time, we were called the Chippewa half-breeds. And so they took us off the island because that was the condition. You know, the United States wanted the island, but not so much the Indians. So they put us on a boat, and we ended up on a different part of the Georgian Bay near a town called Penetanguishene, which is in Anishinaabe-Moan. It means land of the rolling white sands, which is quite beautiful, which also means that it became cottage country. So an hour and a half, north of Toronto, it's where my traditional treaty territory is. I can't really hunt there anymore unless I was, shooting a banker's Pomeranian, which is an option, I guess. So we were moved again. So we left the shores, and we largely reside near a small French-Canadian town called La Fontaine. And so through all of these displacements and relocations, which is not unusual for any people, it became the stories that were our home. So when I was growing up, my grandmother and her sisters, who kept the stories for our community, would tell me two kinds of stories. The first one was the one where there was the seed of a teaching buried in a story, and they would tell it to me, and I had to tell it back to them, different but the same. So the characters and the motions around the seed had to be different, but the seed must remain. And the second stories were the ones that needed to be told back exact, and that's because it was the maps of where we had been and the ways in which we connected to one another. They were our allyships. They were the ways in which, they were the words with which we would recognize our lands and each other's. So I can no longer return to some of the areas where my grandmother's bones are, but I know where her ceremonies were done. I know what that sand feels like on the shore of Drummond Island in November before the ice settles in, but I have never set foot there. The territory that I would have given to my children and taught them how to hunt is now completely occupied. But they will always have home, because our home is in our stories. And so if we cannot connect and keep and protect our stories within our community, then we are losing our home. So when we talk about cultural appropriation and the fact that it's not okay for someone else to take our stories, we are saying, please, don't take our homes again.
Thank you. I want to link here to Tom. Tom, when we think of the figure of the poet, we still have that solo romantic genius. And I think of Wordsworth's phrase of poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Or we could think of J.S. Mill, or that idea of poetry as feeling confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. And yet, what I find so compelling about what you've been doing in London as the Poet Laureate is your collaborations under the heading of the Poet Laureate Presents, one of which he's going to be doing here with a group of artists at the Museum for the Words Festival, which is such a community-oriented approach. What inspired your community-based approach to poetry?
You just call me a genius.
You might have.
I think that's a good start. Yeah, well, if we're going to talk about community, I think, first of all, I just want to say, Words Fest is the perfect example of how community works in London. And I just want to say there are so many partners and so many forces that come together to make this, happen for 5 years now. And I'm staring out at the biggest crowd I've ever seen in this room. And it takes so many partners to do it, but it needs a driving force. And that driving force is Josh Lambier. And I think that we really need to acknowledge the work that he's done for the last 5 years. So community. So the Poet Laureate, the role is to be the ambassador for the arts in London. And so the role is about community, and it's about finding the communities out there, redefining what community means, bringing people together to collaborate, and that's what I've had the privilege of doing for the last over 2 years. And it's just been a joy. And the fun thing also is that there are so many great artists in London, but almost every Londoner is an artist. Because I go around and I talk to people, and someone will say, "Well, I've got this manuscript that's in the basement, and I paint, and I'm a poet." And so that's the other joy. London is a city of artists. And that's the community that I've had such a privilege to work with.
Yeah, it's amazing. Somehow we've convinced people that sport is for everyone, but the arts aren't always for everyone, and they are for everybody. Lisa Moore, I have heard you speak very warmly of the community you have with fellow writers such as Michael Crummey and Michael Winter, writers whom we often associate with that renaissance of Newfoundland literature and culture. And we have had the privilege of welcoming Newfoundland writers here to Words in the recent past, including Wayne Johnston and Robert Chafe. Each of them remarks on the strength of the creative communities. I want to be careful here not to subsume all of Newfoundland writers into one collective group, but there does seem to be something unique about the writing communities of the province. Can you speak about that role and influence of writing community for your work?
Well, when you ask about community, I think immediately of Bernice Morgan, who wrote the story Random Passage, which is a story about European settlement in Newfoundland. And when she wrote that book, which had a very powerful female protagonist, Mary Bundle, who was a scrapper, when she sent it out to Canadian publishers, because Newfoundlanders, I think, were still thinking of themselves as other than Canadian. When she sent it to Canadian publishers, the answer she received was, yes, this is great, but can you set it on the prairies? And the same thing happened to the late and very powerful folk singer Ron Hines, who wrote the song, which you may know, Sonny's Dream. Sonny, don't go away. I am here all alone. Your daddy's a sailor who never comes home. And he was also asked to change that to Your daddy's a cowboy. So the road was paved for that sort of whatever you called us, new generation or whatever it was. And we did a course at Memorial University in the mid-'80s, and the professor was from Ontario, and I remember asking the question, or somebody in the class asked the question, can we use the street names? Or we were changing the street names is what we were doing, because nobody anywhere in the world, we thought, would know of the street names in St. John's, so we would need street names that were in Toronto or were in Paris, and we didn't want to use the street names. And Larry said, yes, you have to use the street names, like write your place down. And of course, those street names ended up being Colonial Street, Kings Road, Queens Road, Duckworth Street. So these are street names that you find all over the post-colonial world. And so there was a connection, a community of places that we, of course, hadn't thought about. So I think those are some of the things I think about coming from that place. Also, St. John's, well, all of Newfoundland, there's a very strong connection artistically. People are in the theater community, are influencing people in the film community, are influencing people who are painters, who are writers. Everybody's working together. And recently in Newfoundland, we have a hydroelectric dam which is threatening to bankrupt the province and poisoning the Indigenous people in Labrador will poison the people who live adjacent to the project because the government refuses to clear the vegetation that will be affected by the dam. And there is a new, I think, connection between the people of the island and the people of Labrador that is historically a brand new coming together in protest over this dam. And it's another colonial story that we see about hydroelectric dams in India, in Tasmania, in all over the world where these dams fail and poison the environment, and where people rise and where new forms of community are shaped over that protest.
Interesting. I'm going to come back to a couple of those points later on too. Jane, you have often remarked how important the stories of Ireland were to your childhood and your family, stories that we could understand as a form of community with one's past, and the stories that orient the way we make sense of the present and the future. Ireland figures prominently in your work, and you've had a long connection with Ireland as a place that you felt at home writing, including a recent stay, as we spoke about on the phone a couple of days ago, as a writer-in-residence at the University College Dublin. Could you talk about how Ireland and the stories of Ireland plays a role in your writing?
Yes, I can. One of the things that I find so fascinating about it is that I really knew nothing at all about Ireland, except what I was told by people who had never set foot on the ground in Ireland, and were 4 generations removed from that country. I think that part of the reason I was so fascinated by it was it presented me with a kind of other world, a world other than the ordinary dailiness of the world that I wandered around in every day, because by the time people are 4 or 5 generations removed from what we called the old country, they have completely idealized it. Really, the people in question were Quins. They were my mother's side of the family. They were agricultural people who had been essentially forced to leave. They didn't want to leave. But I think what I ultimately discovered was that by not knowing anything about it, it kind of freed my imagination to deal with the whole notion of another world, and also allowed me to understand what it's like for Canadians generally. I mean, with the exception of Indigenous people, and even I was so interested to hear what Cherie had to say about, in fact, being moved out of one place and into another. Almost everyone in Canada has, is either an immigrant or is a descendant of immigrants, and therefore carry in their hearts and in their imaginations more than one homeland. Now, this was complicated by the fact that the Canada in which I grew up was a Canada that was filled, in spite of the fact that we were marginalizing places like Newfoundland, we too were filled, Newfoundland was never filled with this, and that was a kind of colonial self-loathing that was so extreme that we didn't actually believe. People of my generation thought it was just nonsense. Of course, you never would have even considered being arrogant enough to assume that, like a real American or a real British person, you might actually be able to publish a book. I mean, that was just unthinkable. We weren't studying any Canadian work in our curriculum. We weren't, there were no Canadian literature courses at the universities. In fact, to be fair, there was one half course at the University of Guelph when I was there, taught by the wonderful Elizabeth Waterston, who was told every year, she has since told me this, that she was leaning her ladder up against the wrong wall if she wanted to proceed through any English department. So I just want to wrap all that up by saying about community. The community of authors into which I was welcomed was so exciting for me, and so, thrilling in ways I can barely express, because it introduced me to other communities. So I got to know people like Rohinton and Franny Mystery. I got to know people like Richard Wagamies. I got to know community after community. And how did I get to know them? I got to know them personally. I got to know Lisa in Newfoundland. But I also really got to know them through their work. So with no thought ever of any one of us hopefully appropriating territory that is obviously the territory of writers who come from those communities, we nevertheless can visit each other and we can become friends, and we can do that through reading each other's books. And what a wonderful place Canada has become in that way, because now, finally, everyone has a voice. But even, as I say, when I was developing, there were people I got to know Madeleine Tien, and I knew her community as a result of her work and as a result of herself. And even interprovincially, because of course, people didn't travel in the way that they do now. I can remember poets who had never met each other, Canadian poets who were well known, whose names were known, meeting in sort of the third part of their life when the League of Canadian Poets was formed. They had never met. It was really quite extraordinary. They knew each other well through their work, but because, certain generations, my generations, Lisa's generation, and Cherie's generation, and we all we've had a lot of support. That's the real truth. And we get to go places and talk to people and meet people, and most important, we get to visit each other's cultures through our work.
Amazing. And that is the force of building community. Absolutely. Tom, I've heard you talk a lot about your environmental work, particularly with your work at the Antler, or the Thames River Conservation, which has inspired your poetic work, including your first chapbook, as well as a recent book, Bad Animals, from Insomniac Press. Many of your poems are deeply invested in places, and that's something that came in every single response, is that power of place in relationship to community. What is it about the local that fascinates you as a poet and an environmentalist?
Yeah, so I grew up close to London. I grew up near Wingham, Ontario, and we had this property outside of Belgrave, Ontario, and it had a river running through it, the Minnesotong River, or the Maitland River, and that was the river that I grew up on, playing in. It was relatively clean. We could swim, we could fish, we could hang out, we could burn things. You know, we were kids outside. And I think wherever I go, I kind of look to find that river again. And, you know, coming to London, I'd always kind of known about London growing up, but I was away for a long time, and moving back here and walking along the river and seeing this river, you know, that kind of began my environmental work, because we were walking along the river all the time, and we were seeing I was seeing all this garbage. And when I say we, I'm talking about my wife Miriam, who can't be here tonight. And I just wasn't used to seeing garbage in a river. It just seemed so out of place to me. And I was just constantly griping about it, until one day Miriam said, "Well, you know, we could do something about that. You know, we could pick up some of that garbage, and you know." And so, and that was the beginning of Thames River Rally, which we've renamed this year as Antler River Rally, to acknowledge Deshkan Zibi as the original name of the Antler River. And yeah, it is site and source of my work, and you know, I see these kind of pillars in my life. One is teaching at Western, and one is my environmental work, and then one is just poetry. And I don't know, poetry somehow kind of emerges out of these three forces. But you know, when I moved to London, it was a place I never thought I would, you know, move to, but I came here and I found this community. We're talking about community. I found this community, and it was a place to put down roots. And I wouldn't be sitting up here today. I wouldn't have a book. I wouldn't have any of those things, really, if I hadn't moved to London and went to a Poetry London reading series, and sat in a room and, you know, asked a question at the end, and someone said, "Hey, what, you know, who are you?" And then, you know, within, you know, as soon as you identify yourself, they put you to work, right? Like, do you want to be on the board? So, you know, that's kind of how it happened and how it emerged.
And thank goodness they did, because you've been forging the type of communities that Jane was describing in such powerful ways in this city for years. Cherie, I was wondering if you could describe the experience that you outlined in terms of displacement, and how that experience of displacement through the process of colonization, how that experience has impacted your writing process in terms of the stories that you tell.
How does colonization and displacement play into my writing process?
Well, particularly in terms of the displacement, that displacement from one place to the other.
Okay, because colonization kind of plays into my breathing. It's, you know, so I mean, wow, that's a difficult question to answer in a succinct way that won't make us apparently want to burn stuff down. You know, so I think I know it's this. So I have a really great mentor and teacher, Lee Miracle. If you don't know her work, please find it. Quick story about Lee. She's Stalo. She's one of the first Indigenous people to be published in North America. And when she went to the publishers, the Canadian publishers, with her manuscript in the early 70s, they said, "This is a great story, but Indians don't read, so we're not going to publish it." Which, you know, sort of speaks to two things. One, that, you know, we can't read, and two, that the only people that want to hear our stories would be us. And so she went out and got 5,000 signatures, because at that time, 5,000 copies, if you sold it, that was a bestseller. So she went out and got 5,000 pre-orders and published Bobby Lee, Indian Rebel. So she's still with us. She's around. She's going to be here this weekend, so please go and see my auntie and give her love. She certainly is a groundbreaker for us. She said this to me after I finished my first story. My first book was Red Rooms. She said, she said, the best kind of stories are flashlights into the darkness, and the best kinds of stories take you home. And she said, my girl, my life has been a long, slow journey over very sharp rocks, but God damn it if I didn't dance over every last one of them. And so I think with that in mind, understanding the beauty that and I say this with all seriousness, when I talk about my indigeneity, my life, because that's really what it is, I say this and I can't stress it enough. I come from a place of privilege. I am privileged to be Indigenous. I am not, disadvantaged or oppressed in some ways, but I am privileged to be Indigenous. And I am privileged because I belong to this land. This is the land of story. I think that the conceit that it would take to think that there's only one form of literature or one idea of excellence is just preposterous, especially when we live in a global story society. And when we are right now gathering on the land of the people of story. Yeah? So I come from this place of privilege, and so whether or not I am displaced, it's that understanding that my privilege is here for me. My stories are here. People like Lee Miracle are here. And they're here for all of us, truly. And this is one of the things that she talks about. And you can ask her these questions. Just say, like, Cherie told us this story about you, and she'll go, God damn Cherie, but then she'll answer you. She talks about the fact that she's having a hard time understanding how things are going wrong. Because she says, I don't get it. If you are of this land, and you are all of this land now, you're here. There's responsibilities and there's also that privilege. And one of those things is that you have access to story. And she always says, I don't know how people can get it wrong. All they had to do was ask. Not everyone has her number, but if you've run into her, ask her. She'll tell you. And so I think, one of the ways in which we can all, become more, decolonized is through literature, is through story. For the first time ever, we have 3 full generations of Indigenous published writers. For thousands of years, we've been telling stories, but now we have 3 generations of published, on this land, Canadian writers. What is now known as Canada, what is currently known as Canada, because you never know, that could change. It has once. So I think now we have reached a critical mass. Now we have critical numbers. Now there are enough of our stories out there, and you have access to them. And Lee talks about this, and I've been meeting with a lot of story keepers, and they say this. There was a time when we were gathering strength and surviving, where our stories were what we packed our culture in, because when you're on the run, you don't carry much. But a story you can carry. And they said, now we are at the time where, Western ideas of where conservation, environment, governance, not going so well, right? I think we can all agree. Now is the time that we need to share our stories, because as the older civilization with an understanding of this land, we have that responsibility to you. And so we all in this room have the responsibility then to pick up those stories. So I think it's this beautiful thing that's happening where we have stages. I am on a stage. I have a microphone. That would not happen 15, 20 years ago. It would not happen. And I am here and I'm speaking to you, and so together we have a responsibility, because a treaty and an agreement, I can't do it. I'm shaking no one's hand. That takes 2 parties to come to an agreement. It takes 2 people to sit at a table and have a conversation, yeah? We can have a meal together, and damn it, we can have story together. And I think that's such a beautiful decolonial practice for all of us. I love that I get to know you through your stories. My stories are my grandmother, right? And if you know my grandmother, chances are we're going to be friends. I don't think you could hate me once you heard her voice and her stories. Speaking of stories, because I promised my husband I was going to tell this story, I have to tell you the night I met Emma Donoghue. So we were at a Writers' Trust event, and I see this beautiful woman across the room, right? And she's wearing the hell out of this gown. Just the most beautiful, and I don't know who it is at first, but it's my first Writers' Trust event, and I'm really nervous, because I'm like a little baby writer. I'm like, who am I going to see? It's going to be so great. And so I run into my friend Kevin Hardcastle, who's a great writer, and of course we meet at the bar. And He's like, yeah, there's some cool people here. I'm like, yeah, we're here. It's enough. And so we're standing there talking, and then this woman glides, honest to God, glides across the room and stands behind him. And she says, and Kevin starts talking to her, and I realize, holy shit, it's Emma Donoghue, right? And so she leans over, because she's lovely, and says, hi, I'm Emma. And I said, yeah, you are. And then I ran away. So I wasn't stalking you, and I apologize. Thank you for sitting at my table.
The story has been amended. I want to keep this thread in terms of the power of place. And Jane, I had a chance to hear you talk at the 70th anniversary of Western University's Macintosh Gallery, which is the oldest art campus gallery in Ontario and the second oldest in Canada. For that lecture, you talked about the power of place, with a specific emphasis on the place of landscape. And I wanted to return to this place in your work and the importance of landscape. In the formative years, you talked very powerfully of being in northern Ontario, to then the Gothic elements of southern Ontario, and to that experience of Ireland that we talked about. Why is landscape so important to you for your writing?
Well, I think Cherie has already answered that question. It's our sense of reality. It's our sense of home. Landscape is the earth on which we live. I think it's really dangerous to ignore it. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I feel that spending hours and hours and hours looking at a screen every day is anti-environmental, not just because we're burning up electricity and God knows what else, but because we're losing touch with the actual world, with actual nature, and we don't then care as much about it as we might have had we, perhaps looked away from the screen and gone for a walk at some point. But I mean, that being said, I didn't really ever preconceive an environmental notion when I was entering the books. It's just that also for me, writing is extremely visual. And so it's filmic almost, in the cinematic, in the sense that I really do see the landscapes through which I am walking. So having said that I knew nothing about Ireland, when I began to write about, or when Ireland began to appear in my work, because I haven't really written about it. I mean, I almost always come back to Canada. I'm not unaware of where I was born and where I grew up and all of that. I still couldn't write about it unless I went there. And so I did spend 3 weeks at least just walking in Northern Ireland, actually. Before I began the novel, because I knew I would have to have something to visualize in order to be able to, in fact, write the novel that seemed to want to be written. But I still, just the whole notion of the perceived world and how moving and wonderful it is, and I feel that way about human communities as well, in the sense that you can turn away from it, you can watch some rendition of it on a screen somewhere, but really connecting with people and being in a room with people, being in a landscape with people, you're never going to be able to reproduce that on a screen. And so I think it's just, in a sense, what I'm talking about is reality.
Yeah, fascinating. And this stitch to Lisa, you have recently said that the more you write, the more interested you are in place. And over the past couple of years at Museum London, we've had the honor to have Robert Chafe, Gillian Kiley, and Wayne Johnson, as I mentioned, each year whom remarked in their own way of that renaissance. But your creativity in that bursting province is so central to place. And Gillian talked about the locality in Newfoundland. What is it about the places and stories in Newfoundland that inspires you so much?
I'm not actually sure there's anything wrong with the microphone. I have no recollection of saying that. I'm sure I did, though. Yeah, it sounded good, didn't it? Well, recently in a creative writing class, a student presented on the work of Jhumpa Lahiri, who, does everybody know Jhumpa Lahiri's work? She's American from India originally. I'm not actually quite sure where she was born, but she's of East Indian descent. And, but she has just moved to Italy and is only now writing in Italian. Like, that is astonishing to me. And she has also said that she wants to write without suggesting where the place is. She doesn't want to locate her stories in a particular place or geography. And that was just like on Thursday. Yes, it was yesterday. So I have been struggling with that thought of what it would be to, and it's because speaking or writing in a language that she has had to learn has really made her aware of the materiality of language. So my stories my stories in this story collection do wander around a little bit and are not just set in Newfoundland, but the previous work, I think it was important for me to capture the place. I'm not even sure why. I also remember, like, the first time I spent real time in Europe was in France for 7 weeks, and we drove all through France. And I remembered thinking, wow, there is not a square inch of this place that is not hasn't been cultivated, where people haven't walked. And it's, incredibly beautiful, of course, and there's, you can't roll down your window without smelling the lavender, and, the lightning hits the olive trees, and it's all very beautiful, but it is very interesting to not be able to get lost, I think. And recently I've had a chance to, because I worked as a lecturer on a cruise ship, to circumnavigate Newfoundland. And it's a pretty amazing, I'll hook you up. Anyway, and also Greenland. We went through the Fjord of Eternity in Greenland, which is a real place. But seeing Newfoundland from the coast was, I mean, I lived there my whole life. I felt I knew it, but I realized that I did not. And there's a town called Francois, which is, you sail back. Have you been there? No. Yeah, so it's astonishing because you're going by a cliff that just goes on forever, as high as the ceiling, and suddenly you come on a gap, and you've been going for hours, and you come on a gap like probably the length of those, well, not very big, and there's a whole community in there, built on the stones, three tiers of houses, just built right on the cliff face, really, isn't it? And then behind it, it appears to be complete and utter wilderness forever. So you're looking at the sublime. It is where you recognize how small you are, and how fragile you are, and how little time we have here, and yet, for whatever reason, that feels invigorating and powerful and humbling, but pretty great.
Amazing. Cherie, your recent book, The Marrow Thieves, features a world in which people have lost the ability to dream, with the exception of North American Indigenous people. The government then attempts to reinstall the ability to dream in the general population by rounding up the Indigenous population, the dreamers. Is that not the most uncanny parallel to our contemporary moment? And they do so by attempting to harness their bone marrow, where it is rumored the power to dream resides. Could you talk a little bit about the power and place of dreams in your writing?
Sure, yeah. So The Marrow Thieves, it started as a short stories, part of an anthology. Thetis Books in Penticton, BC was putting together this speculative fiction collection, and so they called me and said, asked me if I would contribute, and I said, no. I don't write science fiction and speculative writing. And they said, okay, I mean, that's fine. You can say no, but just so you're aware, Eden Robinson said yes. And Richard Van Camp said yes, and Lee Maracle said yes. And I said, fine, like every cool Indigenous person is doing it, I will also do it. And so I looked at what speculative writing is. And it's sort of guessing what's going to happen. And so it can either be utopian or dystopian. Well, I'm Indigenous and a pessimist, so I'm going to go with dystopian. And then I looked at what dystopian stories were, and for the most part, they were writing from or after an apocalypse. And it became very clear. I thought, well, maybe my work is speculative, because everything that we write in this place and time is post-apocalyptic, right? We've survived our apocalypse. I mean, if there's going to be an apocalypse, you want an Indigenous person on your zombie survival team. Because we have survived an apocalypse. We can do it again. So basically it was, that understanding of, okay, we've been through this apocalypse, I'm going to talk about it again. And so then I tried to think of, the most horrific thing. What's the most horrible thing I can throw at these people? And so it became very clear that the worst thing that I could think of was the things that had already happened. And so in the book, the way that the dreamers are rounded up and where they do the experiments to remove the dreams is they reopen the residential school system. So it was taking a long and old, not that old, the last one closed in 1996, but taking a system that we had already lived through and just moving it very slightly into the future. I originally thought it was going to be about 100 years in the future, then Trump was elected, and I realized the end is near. So now it's about 30 years in the future, but that was the basis of it. And the understanding of dreams was this. We know that our ancestors never stopped dreaming. And I mean all of our ancestors. Yeah? They never stopped dreaming. For us, we know that even in the worst circumstances, even in the schools, that they knew we were coming. Because why else would they have carried the language? Why else would they have kept the ceremonies in secret? Why else would they have buried things? There's a whole Native American church to the south where it was taking old ceremonies and putting it into the Bible because they weren't allowed to gather. No more than 3 Indigenous people could be together at a time. Up until the 50s in Canada, it was illegal for us to sing, to dance, to do ceremony together. So we know that no matter what happened to our grandparents, that they knew we were coming. We are their best dream. We are all our ancestors' best possible dream. And so for me, it was the idea of the dreams as hope, and the fact that we carry it in our most, in our sacred knowledge. And there's a lot of teachings and stories about the marrow in a lot of communities, especially in the north, the Dene. When the men go and hunt, they come back and they offer the matriarch the marrow of the bone on bended knee first, because the woman is the most important, and so she eats first, and the marrow is the richest part of the kill. And so that's all it was. It was taking the understanding of an apocalypse and survival where we hide our most important things, and the fact that there was never a break in our dreaming. We know that. We know that the residential schools didn't work. They were a huge failure because we speak our language, because I can tell you these stories, because we can see each other across the room as Indigenous people and recognize that we're family.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Jane, I was actually struck, and maybe this is me creating the stitch, but when I read Cherie's work by a parallel to an earlier book of yours, Away, a work that also featured in Canada Reads competition, like The Marrow Thieves, the state of being away in the book turns to a mythic idea of being visited or stolen by the other world, and a replica left in your place. You use this phrase or this condition to describe the experience of migration for many new Canadians who are wrestling with the experience of being away. I wonder if you could talk about how you came to this idea of being away and how it might help us think through the question of migration and that sense of loss that comes with it.
Yes, I can. I should tell you that I wrote that book a long time ago. It's something, in fact, that somebody said to me when I went to look at Ireland. They explained, and again, this was in the north, but nevertheless in Ireland. They said that if indeed someone was stolen by the supernatural, this person was a folklorist. That it's possible. The belief was that it was possible that an almost exact, although often slightly damaged replica would be left in that person's place, and that the slightly damaged replica would be a person who was perceived to be away. So in other words, they were there, but another part of them was somewhere else. And so, yes, it did occur to me that very much resembled migration. And I think that part of what I came to understand as a result of looking into, because as I said, I was getting to know people who were coming from other countries and settling in Canada, and it made me curious about my own past in that regard. I realized that absolutely nobody had done research beyond a very few people into the big migration that took place on behalf of Irish famine victims coming to Canada, and actually coming at that time to British North America. I think it's important to remember that we were not Canada until 1867, and in fact, there was no such thing as a Canadian citizen, I recently found out, until 1947 and the Act of Canadian Citizenship. Up until that point, you were considered to be a British subject resident in Canada, which is a very interesting and little-known fact, but I thought I'd throw it out here. And what I came to understand was the enormity of that migration. I mean, it makes the kinds of migrations that people are now becoming, people like our friend Mr. Trump down there, becoming hysterical about, look like nothing. Toronto had a population of 22,000 people when 28,000 Irish refugees arrived in Toronto Harbor, and most of them were ill. So they were housed in fever sheds. Anyone who went down to help them, and in fact the mayor of Toronto did go down to help them, became ill. The mayor of Montreal, a place that received perhaps 10 times that number, died as a result of going down. There are mass burial pits all the way along the riverways, all the way down the St. Lawrence River. There's a very huge one in Montreal, more than one in Montreal, in fact. And of course, there's the big mass grave on Grosse Ile, which was our kind of sort of like Ellis Island, except that if you didn't have ship fever when you arrived at Grosse Ile, you certainly had it after you were, quotes, processed at Grosse Ile. So, I mean, so many of us come from that kind of migration that I think we should be mindful of it in some way or another. But once again, these were things that writing the novel taught me. They were not things that I went into the novel knowing, because I was required to do primary research here in Canada in order to just begin to understand the enormity of that migration. I had no idea until I started to write the book. I knew I wanted to write something about Irish coming to Canada. I didn't really even begin to understand what a huge subject it would turn out to be.
Mm-hmm. And I was struck by the parallels of that book to our contemporary moment as well. Lisa, your novels and stories, including your recent book, often use elements of magic realism. You have recently argued that magic realism can help us break through the stalemate of easy thinking to a deeper and more complex truth, especially at a time when the very idea of notion of truth is under strain. You've made this case in your stories that if they hit the right note, you can really change people. How does magic realism help you to tell your stories?
Are you making that up? That's so fantastic. I have no recollection of saying them, but I like it.
I'll give you my sources at the end.
Oh, well, I realized that fiction is incredibly powerful when I tried to, and did in fact, adapted February, my novel, to a play, and realized the constraints of having to, of a stage, that there's a three-dimensional space and everything has to happen there. And this made me realize how exciting. You can do anything on the page. You can traverse time. You can have 1,000 different little, people going backwards and forwards with flashbacks and flash forwards. And if you want someone to bring a plate from, the kitchen table to the sink, you can make it fly across the room. So I realized that but also I think I was really lucky in that I got to work in Banff with Madeleine Tian and Rawi Haj and a bunch of writers to put together a book of fables. And they were fables for the 21st century. And in doing that, we did a little research on fables and realized that it is a really subversive form where when people are under some kind of political siege where things become tyrannical, often stories would emerge that question that power, but it would be animals who would be speaking. And that way nobody would be, thrown in the lockup for opening their mouths because these were just foxes and, crows. So I think that there is a real power in accessing all of the things that fiction can do, because it can really do a lot. It can do everything.
Wonderful. And a stitch here to Tom. Tom, on this thread of dream and folklore and magic realism, you have often described how you've turned to the fantastical to tell stories through the lens of your poetry. And I'm thinking of one poem in particular, and I love this story, so I'm just going to pull this story from you, about vacuums. You knew this is coming. Yeah. I
did, but good.
Could you tell us the story of how you came to write a poem about vacuums and the Thames River?
Yeah, so it's a long poem. I started writing poetry, and I thought, the one good thing about poetry is it's short. And then I ended up, writing this long poem that's in my collection, and it was inspired by me walking down Wellington Street one night and watching these 5 teenagers pick up these old vacuums that were being put out to be picked up by the trash. J.R. Smith Vacuum Sales and Service, the sign. Anyway, so these kids, they pick up these 5 vacuums, and they're, goofing around and hitting each other with them, just having fun, and I was following them. And then they kind of started walking with more purpose, and I noticed they were walking towards the river, on Wellington, towards the bridge. And I was kind of far back, so I started picking up my pace, and of course, as soon as they got to the river, they just chucked those vacuums into the river. And I yelled at something. I tried to sound cool and yell something, and they just laughed at me. I was like, not cool, guys. Anyway. And so it really bugged me. We've been cleaning up the river. We find vacuums. We find all this kind of stuff. And then we also find the attitude that produces action like this. And, you think, how is it possible? How is it possible that you can have this relationship with this river in this way that would allow you to do something like that? And so I thought about it, and I wrote this poem, and it's the story of these 5 vacuums, what happens to them as they float down, and eventually kind of into Lake St. Clair, and then, all the way out. One of them makes the shark makes it all the way out to the ocean. But the fantasy part of it, or the magic part of it, is about your earlier question about the role of environmentalism in my work. Our relationship with the living world is fundamentally broken, and we need new ways to redefine those relationships fundamentally. And so I think that the arts has a real role to play in how we come back. For example, in London, everyone's talking about back to the river, back to the river, back to the river. That's great. I think we should connect to the river. I think we should acknowledge this river and its history. But the idea of going back, I think we need to trouble. Because if we think that there was some, golden age of our relationship with the river, our relationship with the river is fundamentally broken due to colonialism, due to a colonial extractionist logic. And if we come back to the river just thinking, we're back, that's not going to work. We have to come back to the river through understanding its history, through talking to the people who never left the river, right? The people downriver from us, Chippewa First Nation, Oneida First Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. We just had a river summit here last week in these very halls, where water protectors and water managers and indigenous leaders and hydrologists and geologists all got together, and they talked about the river. And a woman from Munsee, Delaware, stood up and said, we talk about Mother Nature as a metaphor. You talk about it as a metaphor. For us, it's literal. And so that kind of redefining a fundamental relationship, I think that is the work of art.
Amazing. So I want you all to do something. I want you to take out the programs that you got when you came here, and I want you to circle all the sessions that these particular writers are on for tomorrow. And I want you to do something else. I want you to circle a session of an artist or a writer that you don't know, and attend that session as well. So tomorrow you can see Jane Urquhart in conversation with Nino Ricci at 11 a.m. and be in conversation with Julianne Hazelwood of CBC London. You can see our Poet Laureate Presents. He's going to be doing Poet Laureate Presents River of Words, and that's something that you absolutely have to check out. And we have Lisa Moore in conversation with Kate Dubinsky of CBC London as well. And Cherie, I think, has to jettison to another area of the world to carry the word. Peru. So that's quite exciting too. Join me in thanking our panel.
And I would like to thank Josh, because you did an incredible job, and thank you so much for those.